Hello and welcome to This Week in the Garden. For this week's episode, we're going to do a garden tour. It's something that I haven't shown you all in a while, kind of how the crops are growing, how the vegetables are doing. And I thought I'd show you all a quick video, just how my garden's doing, what's going well, what's not going well. That was kind of the whole reason that I did this series, was to show you some extension resources, how to apply them in a garden, and then actually what they look like. And so I'm going to give you a quick tour of what my garden looks like, starting with what I planted first.
The onions, they're the first things I planted. Right now they're growing pretty tall. They're just starting to fill out the bulbs, and so in the next couple weeks those bulbs will flop over the vegetative part, and we'll be ready to harvest. So expect a video coming in a few weeks for those. Beside the onions, we have cucumbers. I've got 5 plants that I have, and I've set them up on this old fencing kind of trellis system. I did that because I didn't want to keep training them to a wire, so I put them onto that. They've been producing pretty strong now for about a month, maybe 6 weeks, somewhere around there. I've gotten a lot of cucumbers. They're the muncher kind of variety, so they get fairly small, and what I've been doing is pickling them. I really like dill pickles, so we've been doing that, and I've pickled about 2 dozen jars just from 5 plants. So it's pretty fun. This is the first time I've grown cucumbers. I've grown a lot of other vegetables when I was in grad school, but this is the first time I've grown cucumbers. It's really fun because you're constantly out there picking the cucumbers, so you can actually see the plants growing, and that's pretty cool. Beside the cucumbers, we have tomatoes. I've got a lot of different types of tomatoes. I've got Early Girl, Better Boy, some kind of Roma, and some cherry tomatoes. The tomatoes have kind of been odd this year. They didn't really grow well from the beginning, and then they started growing really tall. Then they kind of fell over, and I didn't want to trellis them or stake them up. I've grown tomatoes before, and I wanted to see if I could do tomatoes in kind of a low maintenance way, so I kind of just let them flop around. I was a little discouraged because they broke over, a lot of them in the center, and so I thought the plants would die. But they actually did fine. They healed over, they scabbed over in that area, and they continued to produce tomatoes. The one thing that I thought when the tomatoes were falling over, I was kind of curious to see if they would shoot out roots from their stems since they're touching the ground. That's just something that tomatoes do. They shoot out roots from their stem area, and a lot of people will actually bury their tomatoes a little bit deeper than their other plants when they're planting transplants. So I wanted to see if I could do that since they fell over, and sure enough, they started producing roots, and kind of I thought that this might make them a little bit sturdier, and really since that's happened, the plants have been really sturdy. They've been producing a lot of fruit. They've been standing up pretty good, even though they kind of look like a mess. And then the one thing I was concerned about was the fruit being kind of on the ground and getting disease, that sort of thing. I didn't really have any issues with that. The tomatoes that were sitting on the ground haven't gotten much disease. I think that's in part because I put down straw. But those are the tomatoes. It's kind of been interesting. They're just starting to get ready now, and I've been picking probably about a dozen every other day. So quite a few tomatoes. I'm not sure if this is the most productive way to grow tomatoes, but I've got about 3 dozen plants in the garden, so I don't really need them to be that productive for 2 people. So beside the tomatoes, I've got bush-style green beans or snap beans. They didn't really do that well because I planted them early in the year. I planted them in April and we got all that cold weather, and beans like the warmth, so they didn't really get very tall. I've harvested from them I think 2 times now, and I've had enough to freeze probably about 10 cups worth of beans, and that's in addition to the stuff that we've been eating. So we've still gotten some beans, but they haven't been doing quite as well as some of the other things in the garden. Beside the beans, we have black beans, and these are for shelling beans. They've done really well. I've never grown these before, so I'm not sure how they're going to do, but the pods are filling up. They're slowly starting to dry down, so I'm going to leave those probably for another month or so, let them completely dry, and then I'll put them in a can or put them in a bag and leave them in a dark place so we can have black beans whenever we want them. Beside the beans, we have squash. We've got 2 different types. We've got zucchini and a yellow squash. The zucchini did really well earlier in the year. Probably 3 weeks back, I was picking half a dozen zucchini a day. So I had a ton of zucchini. Unfortunately, they got squash vine borers, and they started to die. But the kind of cool thing is when I noticed that, I started to add a little bit of fertilizer to the plants. So I added some nitrogen, and the plants have now started to flower again and are growing. So I don't know if this is a last-ditch effort to put on fruit, or if they're kind of healing around that wound where the insect was in the plant. But it's kind of cool. I'll probably pull those out within the next week or so and plant something else there for a fall garden. But that's the squash and the zucchini. I do have some varieties that I planted a little bit later of squash and zucchini that are doing fine now and should be flowering soon. Beside the zucchini, we have a little bit. We've got, I think, 4 or 5 jalapeno plants. Those are doing pretty well. They took a while to grow because of the cold weather early in the year, like a lot of things in the garden. But now I'm starting to pick jalapenos. I had enough where I made some pepper jelly earlier in the year, so that was pretty fun because I've never done that before. But hopefully the peppers will be starting to get ready in the next few weeks, so I can add them to a salsa or something like that. Beside the peppers, we have watermelons. These I planted a little bit late in the year, but I kind of wanted them to be an end of the summer thing, so they'll probably be ready around Labor Day. At least that's the hope. And I've got a handful of plants. This is really the last area that I planted in the garden. Beside that, I have 4 different varieties of sweet corn, and I talked about that in last week's video. The corn's doing pretty well, all things considered, and we're hopefully going to be harvesting in the next week for some of those varieties. And then the last thing in the garden is something I've shown before, and that's the potato towers. It's kind of a weedy mess around it, and that's because the potatoes really grew kind of out into the area, so I couldn't control the weeds. But now they're dying off, so what I'm going to do is cut back the foliage, let them sit for a couple weeks, and then we'll have a video on harvesting our potatoes. So that's kind of a quick garden tour of everything that we've done. We've talked about a lot of these things in the videos, why I've done some things certain ways, but you can kind of see what my garden looks like. It's not perfect. I do have some disease, some insect damage. I've got a rabbit that eats all my tomatoes. I've got some weeds in the garden that I can't get rid of. But we're almost 2/3 of the way done with the summer. So it's been a great season so far, and it's been fun making all of these videos. But just wanted to show y'all something that I had in the garden, what the garden looks like while I'm out on vacation this week. So make sure that you stay tuned for next week's episode from This Week in the Garden.